Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the campfire. This is Clay Steele. This is where we come to enjoy each other's company and tell stories. Tonight, like most other times here, I'm going to tell you a story. This one's about Hank Dillon, the Bigfoot hunter. I only find it here on the hidden corners. And you see, deep in the remote Colorado wilderness, old Hank Dillon, he's hunting for proof of the mysterious and elusive Bigfoot. Something or someone is watching him too. What is stalking Hank in the dead of night? Is it a Bigfoot or something even more sinister? And tonight we're going to start with part 4, The Watcher in the Woods. Something wasn't right. As Hank pulled onto the dirt road from his cabin, the truck whose headlights he had seen moments before was gone, as if it had never been there. Now, how could it have left so quickly, so quietly? After Michelle's panic call, he had grabbed his keys, his jacket, and Sassy. In that short amount of time, the mysterious pickup had just up and disappeared. Unease settled deep in his gut as he made his way down the winding mountain road towards Livermore and onto Virginia Dale. Michelle was pacing the floor of her small cabin. She was rattled. She was certain of what she'd seen. It wasn't a trick of the light or the shadows outside the window. She had seen movement, and then a face. Startled, she'd let out a scream, and the figure just disappeared. She grabbed her gun, she called Hank, and she waited. There had been no sound, and no footsteps on her wooden porch, just a lingering feeling that someone, maybe more than one, was still out there, watching her. Michelle had moved out to the lazy-ass ranch over 3 years back. She'd spent many nights alone at the cabin as caretaker of the property. The owners of the lazy-ass had bought the property as an investment and put an ad in the Fort Collins, Colorado newspaper looking for someone to stay on the property, keep an eye out for squatters. Now, it didn't pay much, but it came with some pretty nice perks. A rustic log cabin, and all the privacy you wanted. The main ranch house was a mile up the winding dirt road, but Michelle preferred that small log cabin. It appealed to her desire to live off the land. She had a garden, she had goats, a couple of beehives, and miles of wilderness. This was the first time in 3 years that she'd been afraid of being alone. Even though she'd encountered mountain lions a couple times and a bear every now and then, this was different. This was threatening. Hank pulled into Michelle's driveway, cutting the engine and stepping out into the still night. Sassy, for her part, let out a low, uncertain growl, her ears twitching as she sniffed the air. Hank felt it too, that prickling sensation along the back of his neck. The same one he always got when something was watching from the dark. He reached for the rifle in the truck's rack before heading up to the cabin. Michelle, she met him at the door. Her face was tight with worry, and her shotgun still clutched in her hands. "I haven't seen him since I called you," she said, her voice just barely above a whisper. Hank nodded, stepped inside, and closed the door behind them. "Are you okay?" She let out a shaky breath and set the gun on the table. "Yeah, it just shook me up. It wasn't an animal, Hank. It was a man. It was a man all dressed in black." "You had the same thing happen at my place," Hank said, his mind flashing back to that shadowy figure disappearing behind the trees near his cabin. "There's something else, Hank." Michelle bit her lip, hesitating. "The dogs wouldn't go after him." God, Michelle's dogs could be fierce. Why, they'd chase off anything. Bears, coyotes, even the occasional trespasser who just happened to turn up the lane looking for some trailhead. But tonight, they had cowered inside, ears flat, tails low, growling, afraid. "Well, that's not normal," Hank muttered. Michelle shook her head. "No, it's not." Outside, a soft breeze rustled the quaking aspen leaves, but other than that, the night was quiet. No crickets or owls to break the stillness. Hank walked to the window and peered out into the dark. A question was gnawing at the back of his mind, one that he didn't have an answer to. If these were government men, if they were really watching, what were they after? And more importantly, why them? Hank kept his eye on the tree line, watching for any sign of movement. The porch light cast a weak glow over the clearing, but beyond that was only darkness. He didn't like it. Whoever'd been watching Michelle could still be out there. He turned back to her. I'm going to check outside. Michelle tensed up at that, but what if they're still out there? Hank nodded. Well, if they are, then we're just sitting ducks in here. If it was just their intention to scare you, then by golly, they succeeded. She swallowed hard, but grabbed a flashlight and her shotgun. Hank motioned for Sassy to stay close, and they stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The night stretched out before them, silent and waiting. They moved slowly, scanning the perimeter of the cabin. Duke sniffed the ground before him, tracking an unfamiliar scent and finding a sign of tracks in the loose soil. He must have come from the back, through the woods, Hank whispered, shining his flashlight towards the trees beyond the garden and the goat pen. Then Michelle gasped, Hank! He spun around, following her gaze, and there, mounted to the top of the wooden windowsill, was a small black device, barely visible. Hank stepped closer, carefully pulling it free. A sticky, tapey substance held it in place. It was sleek, about the size of a deck of cards. With no visible buttons or marking, it looked like some kind of a tracker. Michelle shuddered at that. What is that? Hank turned it over in his hands. It wasn't just a tracker. It was a listening device. Someone had been recording them. We need to call Mallister, Hank said, his voice low and urgent. Now, if they're listening, they'll know we found this. I don't think we should stay here. Not tonight. Michelle hesitated at that, because this was her home, her sanctuary. But the concern in Hank's eyes was enough to convince her. Where do we go? She whispered. Hank tightened his grip on the device and looked towards the dark road ahead, raised a finger to his lips. Then he motioned for Michelle to follow him. Inside the house, he wrapped the device in several kitchen towels and placed it in the oven. Grab your things. I know a place we can stay. Michelle grabbed a bag and threw some clothes in it and got the dog leashes. What if both our trucks have trackers on them? See, I have an old pickup in the barn. It belongs to the ranch, but I have permission to use it any time I want. It's old, but it runs pretty well and it's got gas. Great. Let's take that. Hank grabbed Michelle's bags and headed for the barn. The old Ford rumbled to life, coughing a few times before settling into a steady growl. Hank flicked on the headlights as he backed out of the barn, steering towards the dirt road that led them to the highway. The night pressed in around them, heavy with the scent of pine and earth. Michelle kept her voice low. What do you think they want? Hank shook his head. I don't know. We can stay at my brother's place in Fort Collins for a day or two while Mallister sorts this out. Now, Wade's got a law firm in Denver and home there as well, but he keeps this one by the campus just so they can stay in it when he's handling university business. It's empty right now. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine the only sound. Michelle kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see a pair of headlights appear behind them. Finally, she exhaled. Do you think this is about the Bigfoot? Hank gripped that wheel tighter. I think it has to be. This is all connected somehow. The way the tracks just disappeared and the missing evidence. The government-style trucks with identical plates. But what doesn't make any sense is why they're watching us. Well, Hank was in the kitchen making coffee when Sheriff Mallister phoned him up. "Good morning, Hank. Just got in, saw your message. What can I help you with?" Hank then proceeded to fill the sheriff in on the events that occurred late last night. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Mallister finally responded. "You're telling me that someone was lurking outside Michelle's cabin, and your place too?" "Yeah, that's right," Hank said, leaning back against the counter. "And we found a small transmitter box mounted over Michelle's window. Took it apart, had a lithium battery and a tiny antenna. Looked like a low-range transmitter. I haven't checked my place yet." The sheriff exhaled sharply. "Listen, Hank, this isn't something we should be talking about over the phone. Why don't I come over to your brother's place? We can discuss this in private." Hank hung up, his mind spinning. He busied himself with the coffee, setting out a couple mugs as he waited. And within a few minutes, Mallister pulled up in his unmarked SUV. He stepped out, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a tight-jawed seriousness. Once inside, he took the coffee Hank offered and sat at the kitchen table across from Michelle. He set his hat down, rubbed a hand over his face, before leaning forward. "I wasn't completely up front with you two before. I wanted to be sure of some things first. But now, I think you should know what we're dealing with, especially since you two seem to be targeted right at the moment." Mallister took a sip of coffee before starting. "You see, over the last 6 months, we've had multiple reports of strange sightings all over Larimer County. Most of them don't make it past dispatch because they sound pretty far-fetched. But the ones I've seen," he shook his head, "these aren't just campfire stories." Hank frowned. "Go on." "First, there was that elk hunter up by Rawa Wilderness. He swore up and down he saw a huge, dark figure standing at the tree line and watching him. He thought it was a bear at first, until it walked away on 2 legs, and then his truck wouldn't start. Brand new battery, full tank of fuel, but it was dead for a good hour. Then, just as suddenly, it turned over like nothing had happened." Hank leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "It could have been the elevation. He might have been anywhere between 9,000 to 13,000 feet up there." Mallister smirked. "Yeah, that's what I thought too, until I heard about the hikers near Dead Man's Pass. You see, they were camped overnight when they saw, or they thought they saw, strange lights in the woods. Not flashlights, not campfires. These were bright, bluish white, hovering between the trees. Well, one guy went in to investigate, and the next thing they know, he was waking up 4 hours later, 1/4 mile from camp, disoriented, and no idea how he got there." Hank's fingers tapped against the tabletop. "Now that's a strange one. Do you think these things are connected?" Mallister nodded. "I do, and there's a whole lot more. We've had numerous reports of cattle mutilations all over Greeley, Windsor, Wellington, but here's where it gets even weirder. The reports have spiked near the same area where people have also reported seeing those black trucks, just like the one you saw." Mallister leaned in. "It's like every time someone gets too close to whatever's out there, those trucks show up, and whatever evidence there was, it's gone." Hank exhaled, rubbed his temples. "So what do we do?" Mallister hesitated. "I'll send a few officers over to both your places and have them look around. Now, I think it's a good idea to stay here in town for a few more days until we can do some investigating, just to be on the safe side. You can go check on your goats and whatever else you need to do, but till we figure out what's going on here, I know I'd feel better knowing you two were just a bit closer to town." "Oh, and one more thing," Mallister says. "There's someone I want you to talk to. A buddy of mine. He used to be with the FBI. Retired up to Walden a few years back. His name's Tom Sheffield. He'd been following these cases pretty close. He likes to stay under the radar. Says it's safer that way. But if he's willing to talk with you, I'll set it up." Hank mulled it over. "All right, I'll talk to him." McAllister nodded to him. "Good. I'll call him this very morning." He stood, draining the last of his coffee before setting the mug down. "And Hank." "Yeah?" "Be careful." Hank walked him to the door and watched as the sheriff climbed into his SUV and pulled away from the house. He had a bad feeling about all this and a sinking suspicion that things were about to get a whole lot stranger. After McAllister left, Michelle washed their coffee mugs and placed them in the dish rack. "Hank, there's something I've got to ask you. Why would the sheriff ask you to meet with the guy up in Walden? If this is as serious as it sounds, wouldn't it be considered official business? I mean, you're not affiliated with the police or the military in some way, are you?" Hank grinned back at her. No, nothing like that. McAllister has a brother-in-law named Earl Rawlins. Well, Earl hired me to do some investigative work for him, basically to track down the so-called Bigfoot sightings around our area. I know that's got to sound a little crazy to you." "Crazy?" Michelle laughed. "A week ago, I would have thought you were crazy. Now, I'm not so sure." As Michelle and Hank bounced down that dirt road in the old ranch truck, the golden morning sun filtered through the pines, casting long shadows over the road. The eerie events of the night before seemed pretty distant now, softened by the light of day and several cups of coffee. "You know," Michelle said, glancing at Hank, "things don't feel quite as terrifying in the daylight." They pulled up to Michelle's cabin. Everything looked just the way they left it. No signs of intruders, no more strange figures lurking in the trees. Her goats bleated a greeting and the chickens pecked at the ground, oblivious to the night's disturbances. Michelle hopped out of the truck and went straight to the feed shed. She scooped grain into the pails, moving with pretty practiced efficiency. Once all the animals were fed and watered, Michelle grabbed a few essentials from inside the cabin. Some clothes, her laptop, and a small pistol she kept in a locked drawer. "Just in case," she murmured, slipping it into her bag. "Well, let's check my truck," Hank said, crouching by the wheel wells, running his hands along the undercarriage. Nothing at first. Then, near the back bumper, he spotted something small and metallic just out of place, a tiny black box tucked just out of sight. "Damn it," Hank muttered, reaching for it. He peeled it off with a tug, turning it over in his hands. Michelle leaned over his shoulders. "What is that?" "Well, it's a GPS tracker." Hank's jaw tightened. "They've been keeping tabs on me." A chill ran through Michelle. "So they know everywhere you've been." Hank nodded and continued checking his truck for anything else that seemed out of place. Found nothing. "We can check my cabin later. Let's load the dogs up and head up to Walden. I want to see what Tom Sheffield has to say." Well, the drive to Walden led through some of the prettiest country in Colorado. The little town of Rustic sits along the Cache La Poudre River with a rough-hewn log cabins and forests of aspens and blue spruce. And just when you think it can't get any prettier than this, the land opens up to high country meadows and the green alpine plains of Walden. The town sits at an elevation of 8,099 feet and is flanked by the Platte River Wilderness Area and the Arapahoe National Wildlife Refuge. It sits in the center of North Park, about 60 miles northeast of Steamboat Springs and 20 miles south of the Wyoming border. When spring comes to North Park, the red willows begin to grow in the creeks, ditches, and riverbanks of the wetlands, and Walden becomes the perfect grazing ground for moose. As food becomes more plentiful, the moose begin to move on, following the rivers into the higher country. But for about 6 weeks during the months of April and May, the moose are abundant. You can see them crossing Main Street, hanging out in people's yards, and nipping the new branches of lilac bushes in Hanson Park. Hank slowed the truck as they approached the weathered sign that read Sheffield Ranch. Michelle leaned forward in her seat, taking in the wide expanse of land, an open range of meadow and grasslands, dotted with few outbuildings, and a long log house with a green tin roof. The dogs stirred in the back seat, their ears pricking at the sight of the grazing horses, and the towering moose just beyond the split-rail fence. "You weren't kidding," Michelle said, nodding toward a cow moose and her calf, casually chewing on the fresh grass. "They really do treat this place like their own." "Well, I've always loved it here," Hank replied, cutting the engine. The moment that he stepped out of the truck, he inhaled that clean, crisp air, thin from the elevation, but rich with pine and damp earth. Tom Sheffield was already walking down the gravel path towards him, looking every bit the Colorado rancher. He was wearing a pair of worn jeans, a canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and an old weathered cowboy hat. He extended a hand to Hank, his grip still strong. "Glad you came," Tom said, giving them both a nod. "Why, Jim called this morning and told me what had happened to you two. I want you to know you aren't the only ones seeing strange things." He looked towards the mountains that rose just beyond his property line. "Let's talk inside." They followed him up the steps of the porch and inside the log house. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. Old ranching photographs lined the walls, alongside framed newspaper clippings and a few mounted antlers. Tom motioned for them to sit at the kitchen table while he poured coffee from a beat-up old percolator. "You ever get the feeling someone's been in your house, but nothing's out of place?" he asked them, setting the mugs down and pulling out a chair for himself. Tom Sheffield wasn't always a rancher living in the remote wilderness of North Park. Before he settled into a quiet life raising horses and cattle, he had been a high-ranking FBI agent with deep ties to the intelligence community. His career had taken him from field operations to the corridors of the Pentagon, where he worked on classified projects that most people wouldn't believe even if he told you. But it wasn't until he started working alongside top military officials that he realized just how much was being kept from the public. For years, Tom was assigned to the counterintelligence, where he investigated foreign espionage, black ops, the kind of covert programs that blurred the lines between science fiction and reality. He had seen firsthand how the government conducted secret operations, often under the guise of national security. Some of these operations involved surveillance of individuals deemed of interest. Others had more unusual objectives. One such project, which he stumbled upon in the early 1980s, was a program under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA as an acronym, that focused on unidentified biological entities, creatures that defied scientific classification. The official term used in documents was anomalous terrestrial beings, or ATBs, but off the record, agents referred to them as cryptids, and at the top of the list, Sasquatch. There were reports spanning decades, files filled with grainy photographs and footprint analysis, and even testimonials from military personnel stationed in remote locations. Special teams were deployed to track and observe these entities, but their orders were clear: no public exposure. If evidence surfaced, it was to be confiscated, witnesses silenced, and disinformation spread. Now, why was that? Because whatever these creatures were, they weren't just undiscovered animals. They were something else entirely. Tom had seen documentation suggesting that these beings displayed intelligence, higher than what should have been possible. Some reports even hinted at possible communication, organization, and the ability to evade modern tracking technology. And one particular case haunted him, An incident in the Cascade Mountains where a military unit went missing after engaging with an unknown entity. The only survivor claimed they had been herded away from a restricted area by something massive and unseen. The official report blamed a rogue bear attack. Tom knew better. Years later, after retiring from the Bureau, Tom moved to Walden, hoping to escape the lies and the half-truths he had spent his career uncovering. But the past had a way of finding him. Over the last decade, reports of strange activity had increased. Ranchers spoke of mutilated cattle with no blood at the scene. Hikers disappeared without a trace. And black SUVs with government plates were seen on logging roads where no official operations were supposed to be taking place. Then came the most disturbing evidence. Footprints right on Tom's land. Massive, human-like, but with a stride too long and a depth in the snow too heavy for any normal man. He'd collected plaster casts and taken photographs, but every time he tried to bring them to light, someone intervened. His emails disappeared, files were corrupted, and once he even received a call from an old contact in D.C. warning him to drop it. After years of doing his own research, Tom decided that indeed the Sasquatch was a real entity, that it appeared to follow the migration pattern of the moose, more than likely its major food source, and that one occasionally wandered onto his property. He believed that they were really elusive, difficult to track, and had an uncanny ability to avoid detection. It wasn't just their natural camouflage or remote habitat that protected them. Tom was convinced that they possessed a heightened awareness, an intelligence that allowed them to sense danger long before most of us would know. He'd noticed patterns in their movement, not random, but calculated, sticking to dense forest corridors, using terrain to mask their trails, and appearing only during twilight or heavy weather. What troubled Tom most was the feeling that the government knew all this too, and had for decades. Every time credible evidence surfaced, it vanished. Reports were scrubbed, samples lost, and witnesses either discredited or silenced. He suspected the Sasquatch were more than just another undiscovered species. Some of the files he'd seen during his time with the Bureau suggested something much deeper. Possibly genetic anomalies or ancient beings tied to the forgotten part of Earth's history. Or there were even whispers that the military had captured one, or several, and had done highly secret autopsies and experiments on the large creatures in an attempt to understand and evaluate the threat. Tom's theory had evolved into something bigger than just cryptid sightings. He believed the creatures were being tracked, maybe even studied. The black trucks, the transmitters, the strange signals intercepted on old ham radio frequencies, it all pointed to an organized effort to monitor these beings. The truth, he feared, wasn't just being hidden, it was being weaponized. Now, with Hank and Michelle witnessing the same kind of surveillance that he'd been part of, Tom knew that this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was watching them, and it wasn't just curiosity. They were tracking something, or someone, and if history had taught Tom anything at all, it was that when the government got involved in covering up the truth, things tended to get dangerous. Looking out at the moose grazing near his fence line, Tom's mind wasn't on the wildlife, it was on the mountains beyond, the untouched wilderness where the real secrets lay hidden. Tom unrolled a large topographical map. Red dots marked dozens of locations throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. As Hank studied the map, he felt a twinge of disbelief. Wow, there were a lot more sightings than I ever imagined. Tom nodded to him. Yep, and that's just from the last 6 years. Hank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. When I saw my first Sasquatch, I thought I'd gone crazy. Everyone else thought I was crazy too. All my friends, my family, And yet you're telling me that there have been dozens of sightings in all these various mountain locations? Michelle looked up from the map. My mother was Shoshone, and her family were originally from the Red Feather Lakes area. When I was growing up, she told me many stories of the Saskats, which were large, hairy, and possibly supernatural beings that inhabited the wilderness all over Colorado, and especially near here. We always believed they were real. Well, I'm convinced now too, Hank replied, and what I've seen, it doesn't surprise me in the least that the government has its hands in this. Look what they've done out at Area 51 and Roswell. Tom gave a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Area 51 and Roswell? Those are basically decoys, Hank. The stories they let leak just enough to keep the curious busy chasing myths, while the real operations happens in places no one talks about. He leaned over the map again, tapping one of the red dots near the Colorado-Wyoming border. This triangle here, Red Feather Lakes, Medicine Bow, Mount Zirkle, there are deep caverns and abandoned mine tunnels in this range, most of them unmapped, some sealed off decades ago under environmental restoration orders. But the truth is, those closures were too sudden and too convenient. And if the government's been building underground facilities like the ones I saw blueprints for back in D.C., then it's just possible we're standing over something massive. Hank rubbed the back of his neck trying to process that all. You're saying that there could be a base here, like a NORAD-style command center, but completely off the record? Tom nodded grimly. Off the record, off the grid, black budget. If I had to guess it, it would be hidden inside one of them mountains in this triangle. And from the movements of the trucks, the helicopters, and the signal jammers I've been tracking, I'd say it's absolutely active. A long silence followed, broken only by the soft snore of Sassy lying under the table. Michelle's voice was quiet when she spoke. But what do we have to do with any of this? Why would they care what we're doing or where we're going? I don't understand why they'd even be interested in us. Tom shook his head. Hard to say. I know Hank here has been tracking sightings. Mallister told me that Earl Rollins had thrown some money on the table, and let's just say, if Earl's money's involved, then he suspects something far larger than just a few cryptid sightings. The sun shone through the curtains in Tom's spacious log home. The three of them sat in uneasy silence, the weight of their conversation settling like a heavy snow. Hank reached for his coffee, but his hand froze halfway to the cup. A faint rumbling sound, deep and low, vibrated through the floorboards. Tom was already on his feet, moving towards the window. That's not thunder, he muttered. Michelle's eyes darted to the map still spread across the table, and instinctively began rolling it up. Well, then what is it? Outside, under a full glare of the midday sun, a sleek black helicopter crested the tree line and flew over Tom's acres of green pasture, sending the horses and the moose running. It flew low, too low, and moved with the deliberate precision, casting a massive shadow over the clearing. Matte black, with no visible markings, the aircraft flew directly over the log house, the rotor wash whipping up pine needles and dust in a roaring cyclone. It hovered over the ranch house for just a moment, then sped off south across the horizon. Tom turned back from the window, his face pale. They know we're here. Well, there you are, folks. Now, if you haven't heard the first 3 or 4 chapters of this, you need to get caught up. This story's getting good. And I'm going to tell you some more of this story next week, right here on the Hidden Corners. Till then, this is Clay Steele. Be good to one another.